I'd like to introduce Kristen again, who is going to be talking about life-saving protocols. So welcome again, Kristen.
This doesn't sound like it's working. I can yell really loud, but... Hello? Can you hear me? Oh, cool. Hi. A couple things I don't want to forget to say. One is that so many of you didn't get to attend my foster day-long, and foster care is the reason that I came to this conference. It's the reason that I traveled truly across the globe to speak with you, because I believe foster care is the future of our movement. And just like with humans, we'll end the institutionalization of animals through foster care. If you are interested in following the conversation about what's happening in foster care innovation, there's a Facebook group, and it's moderated by my colleague Kelly Dewar and I. It's called Animal Shelter Foster Care, Animal Shelter Foster Care Innovation, I think. A few of you have joined it. Is that the right name? Animal Shelter Foster Care Innovation? Yeah. That Facebook group is a constant conversation about creating foster-centric organizations, and what that means are organizations where foster is at the heart of the operation, not just another program for the shelter. And another way to keep in touch with me is find me on Facebook. I'm Kristen Hassen Auerbach. We can be Facebook friends, and all I do now will tell you is talk about animal welfare. You may have to see a few pictures of my dogs, but you'll get to hear lots of interesting conversations, and I try to post about the most immediate conversations happening in animal welfare in the US. So it's now 3:30. You've got to be exhausted. I can hardly imagine what you must feel like sitting there. But I wanted to give a shout out to someone in the audience who, if they are here and want to identify themselves, they can, and if not, they don't have to. But I've been speaking with all of you, and I've been so inspired by why you're here and the struggles you're dealing with. And I met a very special person who is sort of in the process of cancer treatment, and has gotten not great news, and is looking at the future of their treatment, and is here at this conference. And when they talked to me, they said that despite what they're going through and their medical issues, that they feel so inspired to be here with all of you and getting to learn and getting to be part of this movement, and really lucky to get to spend their life doing this work. And that I just thought that you all should know that you all are incredibly inspiring too, and that despite all of our personal challenges, we're in this room and we're part of something really amazing and incredible. I think that personally, being in the US right now feels really scary, and politics are truly terrifying. And most social movements, people are just depressed. And I don't even look in my Facebook feed anymore because I don't want to see it. But we're part of this social movement that's actually working. And that is really exciting. We are doing it, and we are accomplishing something here together. This talk I'm going to give is the hardest talk that I give. It's about killing dogs for behavior. And when I say the word kill, sometimes people look at me like I'm nuts. But I use that word because euthanasia is a term reserved for humanely ending the life of an animal that's suffering. But the hardest part of our work is ending the lives of animals who aren't medically suffering and who, for their own good, don't need to die. And there's no other good. We don't really have language for this. Rich Avanzino, who really is considered the father of the no-kill movement in the US, used to use the term execution. That sounds even more horrible to me. And so while I somewhat use the terms interchangeably, I think it's important that we don't sugarcoat what is happening to healthy treatable animals. And that's coming from someone who has to perform that act as well. So at our shelter, our team uses the word kill when we don't mean ending the life of medically suffering animals. I think most of what I'm going to tell you right now are happy stories. I try to balance them, the sad ones, but this is a happy story. This is Rocco. He was a really difficult dog in our shelter. Back in 2013, we were youth listing dogs for failing SAFER evaluations. We used to do behavior evaluations, and he was a dog that was youth listed for failing his behavioral evaluation. Instead of euthanizing him, we asked the public for help. We found a foster home, and we provided that foster home with some behavior training and support. And Rocco actually went home to foster, which saved his life. Rocco was part of an initial study we did in 2013 to take behaviorally youth-listed dogs and send them to foster homes in order to save their life. And we didn't do anything special. We just sent them to foster. And Rocco went to foster, and we gave his owner support, and over time, Rocco kind of normalized, and this is him in his home, and this is what his dad said. It took training and loving him unconditionally for Rocco to finally start to see that other dogs and humans pose no threat and just want to love on him. We now have him around children and other pets with no worries. He's extremely fascinated around smaller children and almost seems just to watch over them to protect. It's the cutest thing ever. There were speed bumps, but the outcome outweighs all of that. We have the most cuddle-loving dog in the world. He wants nothing more than belly rubs and to destroy tennis balls, LOL. Thanks, you and your hard work, and for loving these dogs and letting them live their best lives. So that's Rocco's dad. And what I don't want to do today is to tell you that you can take every dog with behavioral challenges and every dog that doesn't do well in the shelter and just send them home and they're going to be totally fine. That isn't enough, and it's not what our movement needs to do. But this talk is about how to start to build safety nets under those at-risk dogs. How many of you here are dealing with at-risk cats or dogs for behavior? You're dealing with making life and death decisions. Most of you? And how many of you are trying to save animals that are at risk in the shelter for behavioral reasons? Okay. Nell said that it was, when we talked, she said, you know, it's important you talk about cats and dogs because both are at risk for behavioral reasons here. And it is not my area of expertise because we don't euthanize, we don't kill cats for behavior. And that's primarily because if we can't adopt out a cat, we have so many outcome options for those cats. We can SNR, TNR, put them into barn cat programs, et cetera, et cetera. And we also do have behavioral cat foster placement. So we have a whole foster coordinator dedicated to adult cats. Her whole job is placing cats with special medical and behavioral needs in foster. But even though I'm not talking specifically about cats as much, most of what we are talking about applies to cats as well. Yeah. That cat was really cute. He was a hot mess. Medically, behaviorally, his ears were all crumpled. I forget what causes that. There's a thing that causes that. Okay, so this is the wall of dead dogs at my shelter. We make the decision to kill dogs for behavior anywhere from 5 to 12 times a month. We get tons of dogs in with some known behavioral history. We had a dog brought back not that long ago, and the owner kept telling us how he was very aggressive, very aggressive. And so we asked, what do you mean? And he said, oh, he was trying to bite my son. So we asked him to explain the situation, and he said, well, my son had a gun, and he was trying to bite the gun. And so we were like, your son had a gun, and he was trying to bite the gun. And he's like, well, the gun was made out of a peanut butter sandwich, and he had chewed the sandwich into the shape of a gun, and the dog was trying to eat the sandwich. And these are not uncommon situations. So we always ask a lot of questions and try to find out what really happened. But I'm showing you this picture of dogs that have died for two reasons. One is that dogs do die for behavioral reasons in our shelter, and we're really careful about how we make those decisions. We give every dog a certain set of rights before making that decision to end its life. This wall is a wall that our volunteers made, and it's one of several in our shelter, and we allow the volunteers to remember the dogs that have died a few different ways, and this is one of the ways. And this is in one of our volunteer rooms where we keep these dogs' memories alive. So the problem is that in most shelters, dogs aren't just at risk of dying for known behavioral challenges. And when I say known behavioral challenges, I mean dogs that have actually caused harm to an animal or a person. They're at risk for a lot of other reasons. One, housing restrictions means there are a lot more big dogs in shelters. We have, I was talking to Trish earlier, and I think I underestimated. On any given day in our shelter, we have 500 to 1,000 medium and large dogs in our custody, and the vast majority of those are pit bull dogs. So it's a lot of dogs we're dealing with on any given day. Is that because there's too many of them and people don't want to own them? No. Every day, we turn away 10 adopters who aren't allowed to own those dogs. We don't turn them away, but they realize that they're not allowed to have those dogs. We don't check their, we'll talk about that tomorrow, but they see the dogs and they realize that in their apartment or their homeowners association, they're not allowed to have a big dog. So those people aren't able to take the dog they want. And housing restrictions also mean that 10 times a day someone surrenders a dog that they love dearly, but they have to choose between being homeless and keeping their dog. So our shelter is really full of medium and large dogs. And in a lot of shelters, that means that decisions have to be made for space, and most often the dogs that die in those situations are ones that don't behave perfectly. Dogs that are declining in shelter and their behavior's worsening, this is the vicious cycle that we all go through. A dog comes in, it's fine. A month goes by, it's less fine. It's starting to exhibit stress-related behaviors. It's starting to get jumpy-mouthy. It jumps up and nips someone. Then fewer people want to handle it. It sits in the shelter another month. And we all know how that story ends. And the problem is that there's no standard protocol for making life and death decisions. So most of the time, at the end of the day, it comes down to whoever feels like that dog should be the one euthanized. There's problems with how we make the decisions to euthanize dogs for behavior. First, those decisions are subjective and they depend on the person looking at the dog. When I first started working in shelters, we had this big fat red marker, and you'd have a row of dogs, and you'd walk through, and any dog that didn't come up to the front of the kennel and wag their tail, you'd write a big E on their kennel, and that meant that that afternoon they were going to lose their life. That's how we used to make those decisions. Today it's a little bit more nuanced, but oftentimes no more thought goes into it than that. The other problem with how we make decisions is that we don't give people the opportunity to help. And I'm talking here about dogs that are declining in the shelter that are going to be euthanized because of their behavior in the shelter, not because they're inherently unsafe or have demonstrated harm to a person or animal. The way that we make decisions doesn't consider alternatives, and the problem is that it makes our community not trust us. It makes them feel like we're hiding something, and especially this is true with volunteers who have handled these dogs. Once they become at risk, the volunteers aren't given the opportunity to help save their lives. That sign used to hang in PAC, my shelter, in 2013, and it kind of makes me laugh now, because so these were all the animals that would be automatically euthanized in our shelter up until 2014. Well, okay, so if the dog came in and had aggressive behavior towards people and animals or with food, it was going to die. Okay, get it. We were euthanizing for space. That makes sense. But then you get to this no socially unacceptable behavior, which kind of seems just so absurd. Like, I don't even know what that means. I know that like every one of my dogs is incredibly socially unacceptable. I have a hound that like can only greet you by staring in your eyes while she clutches you closely. So socially unacceptable behavior was a reason for an animal to die, but the public doesn't accept that anymore. They want to know why animals are living and dying in shelters. And then it says any development of unacceptable behavior after the animal is turned in will result in euthanasia. So here's the starting points. Behavioral assessment, standardized behavioral temperament tests. Dr. Emily Weiss, who invented the SAFER test, first saw me present on this in 2013. The SAFER is one of the main shelter evaluation tests, and she stood up and she talked about how she never intended the SAFER to be used to make culling decisions. It was never meant to be used to determine life or death. It was supposed to be used to help figure out the next step along the pathway for any particular dog. But that is how we've used those tests. So starting points are that behavior assessment should not be used to make life and death decisions. In our shelter, we are euthanizing 1% to 2% of total intake for behavior. And what I mean by that is that your shelter may euthanize more than that. That's what we consider, and what we're finding in most shelters is that 1% to 2% are likely inherently truly unsafe to place with the rescue group, a sanctuary, or back into the community. And so we expect this performance indicator, we expect a certain number of our dogs to be truly unsafe. The rest may not be, the rest that you're euthanizing, if you're euthanizing 6% for behavior, that may still be legitimate, but it's likely that many of those you don't have the resources to save. So what we wish existed were long-term rehabilitation places for dogs. We don't have them. So we are euthanizing a fair number of dogs. It's not because those dogs really inherently will try to kill you if they see you, but we don't have the resources to save them yet. Every dog should be treated as an individual, and we need to think carefully about our role as the gatekeeper and the guardian of dogs from the community. In some cases, that's warranted, but not in all. So what we're going to encourage you to do is develop a protocol. When I first started piloting the protocol I'm going to tell you about today, I got together with a group of folks, and we decided that the number of animals we euthanized didn't matter. We weren't going to focus on that. We may even increase the number of animals we euthanize for behavior, but we wanted to have a standard protocol to ensure that everyone was treated fairly. And I'll share these. I'm happy to share these documents that I'm going to go through with you because they're really, really helpful. We committed to treating every dog as an individual, and the goal was to build trust, to start to look at our life-saving gaps, to eliminate mistakes, and to start to have volunteers and fosters and staff work together to save lives. And we wanted to eliminate the mistakes, and what I mean by that is, so I'm really careful, and I follow my own protocol. I sometimes still will euthanize the wrong dog. It happened to me like 2 months ago. We had 6 free-roaming dogs. One of them was really aggressive, and the one that we decided to euthanize was not the dog that had been the primary instigator. I'm so careful, and that's still happening to me because I'm dealing with a massive number of dogs. This protocol helps you minimize the number of times that happens. That was one of our youth-listed dogs. She was a case of mistaken identity. Her and her brother were involved in an incident. I'll talk a little bit more about her in a minute. So the goal is to give every dog a fair chance at a live outcome, to manage behavior just like we do urgent medical cases, and to be transparent and to be accountable to the public in our decision making. I want to be able to stand up in front of the news on every single dog that we decide to kill for behavioral reasons, to stand up and explain why we did that. Okay, so here's the reasons people tell us they cannot do this. Number one, they don't have the resources. How do they have time? Yes, I don't have time. This is one of the most important things we do, though, as leaders in our organization. People worry and they feel fearful about doing this. They feel like they aren't sure they can do it, and they have doubt about their ability to make decisions. And honestly, we should all have doubt about our ability to make decisions, because almost none of us working in this field are behaviorists. We're not veterinary behaviorists. We're typically just your regular old people. In the US, a lot of shelters are hiring, quote, behaviorists. They're usually just people that love dogs. So we should be questioning ourselves a lot, and we should be reaching out to experts when we can, which we certainly do. Okay, the other thing standing in your way is breed bias. In most shelters, pit bull dogs are more likely to die. In our shelter, we don't have any breed of dog more likely to die than another breed, and that really should be your goal. And overcrowding. So if you're still making decisions because you're euthanizing for space, this protocol may not be entirely appropriate for you. If you're making decisions because you're crowded and you're euthanizing for space and you're selecting dogs with behavioral challenges, this protocol is still for you. This is a great article. I think I talked about this in the day long. My colleague Ryan Clinton just wrote this. It's about liability, and he talks about how you need to have a contract, you need to have justifiable reasons for all your actions, and you need to ensure full disclosure to adopters and fosters of any animal in your care. The way we do this at PAC is not only do we give people all the behavioral and medical notes in writing, we also go through them verbally. And if it's a dog with any known history, we have a whole special process that the counseling is conducted by a manager who can really explain to people what we mean, because guess what? Barrier reactive doesn't mean anything to most of the public. Dog selective, half the people you tell are dog selective, they think that means that the dog wants to go select its new friend at the dog park the next day. We have to start remembering that we speak a lot in org speak, and it's our responsibility to really explain to the public the dogs in our care. All of us doing sheltering right now are talking about this issue, that known history of causing harm to a person or animal, that needs to be contextualized, but known history may be the best predictor of future behavior relative to a dog that's just not doing well in the shelter. And the thing we learned from our behavioral foster study is for dogs that just aren't doing well in the shelter, getting them out of the shelter is critical to figuring out if that's a behavior that's just associated with the stress of the shelter. Okay, so here's what dogs are at risk for in our shelter and what they're not at risk for. Our dogs may be at risk of euthanasia for biting a human, and that depends on the circumstances and the severity. They may be at risk for killing or injuring other animals. Again, really depends on the circumstances and the severity, and if they're legally declared dangerous or vicious. But every animal is considered for an individual set of circumstances, and we look at, like, are there multiple factors? One of the things that scares me the most, and this may just be me, one of the things that makes me the most nervous is a history of a dog escaping combined with aggressive behaviors towards animals or people. Like that, those combined factors, and I'm a layperson, remember, I don't know much about behavior, but I know practically those behaviors are likely to be challenging in another home, and we have a responsibility to make sure that dog is going to go to a place where it's going to be secure if it's going to leave the shelter. Dogs are not at risk for failing or doing poorly on standardized temperament tests. We evaluate all of our dogs in playgroup, so we're learning about them in real-life settings. The way that we evaluate dogs is medical handling, so they get an exam by a technician or a veterinarian. They get handled in and out of the kennel by our volunteers, and they go to playgroup. That's how we evaluate every dog, so we're learning about them in a more real-life setting. For dogs that we're not sure about, so we're like, he seems like he's really cautious, he's cowering in the back of his kennel. We have a whole group of volunteers called our decompression volunteers, and they're people that are really skilled dog handlers, and those dogs go into a special program so that they're not handled by your average volunteer until we know a little bit more about them. Dogs are not at risk for common behavioral challenges like being jumpy, mouthy, fearful, difficult to handle. That does not put a dog at risk. And fear, anxiety, shyness, stress-related behaviors, those also don't put dogs at risk. We know that the shelter is a terrifying place. My colleague Kelly talks about it being like Grand Central Station. Grand Central Station is like a really busy train subway station in New York. And so it's like you're in a busy subway station and you suddenly hear a bomb threat. That's how a lot of our dogs feel in our shelters. And so we're really conscious of that when we're making decisions about them when they seem fearful or stressed out. OK, so here's the process. We have a mandatory minimum holding period. We passed an ordinance in Austin, which has been debated more than I expected, that you could place a dog right away. You could place it within 3 days in an adoptive or foster home, but you couldn't euthanize it for 7 unless it was medically suffering. This turned out to be really game-changing for us. I'm the kind of director, we're so busy that I'm the kind of director that if we think a dog is going to have to be euthanized for behavioral reasons, I'm like, why are we waiting? Let's just move. We are full. Well, it made us step back and take a little bit of extra time in evaluating and assessing those dogs. And so the mandatory minimum hold period gave us that time to say, all right, this dog came in, it was really fractious, difficult, and it's improving over these days, and made us take a second look. So that minimum hold period both protects the animal from euthanasia, but allows you to place it more quickly. And some of you may consider something like that. Your hold times on your stray holds are very long in some cases. Oh, this is one of my favorite dogs. She came in, and she was like the whale eye, back of the kennel, kind of low growling at you. And she was a dog that if we had evaluated her in the kennel, she would have had a big red E written on her kennel card. But instead, one of our specialty volunteers who handles our fearful dogs got her out. And that picture is, no kidding, taken 5 minutes after she got out of her kennel. She was like, oh, this isn't bad. OK. And her name's Cowgirl. She ended up getting adopted and making national media. And I think this story headline read, what 5 minutes with a volunteer can do to change a shelter dog's life. Number 2, we assign a case manager. So we have someone on our staff, and all they do is behavior dogs. And this is not a behaviorist. This is not a person with a special, they have had some behavior training, but they're not a behaviorist. But what they are is they're the case manager for the dog. So their job is to read all the notes on the dog. They go and verify. They make sure that the kid holding the gun wasn't a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. They make sure we even have the right dog identified, which a lot of the time we don't. 10 minutes, oi. And they look at outcome options. They determine, and they bring that dog, after they have done the case review on that dog, they bring that to my desk. And every few days we review 10 or 12 cases together. OK, they call the owner or finder. So if your dog is going to die in our shelter, if you've surrendered it, you don't get an option to know that. We don't give people an option unless there's been a severe incident of aggression. So if someone's really traumatized, we're not going to call them and bother them. But in most cases, if somebody surrendered a dog and that dog becomes at risk, we call and talk to them about it. And it's been really interesting because a lot of people with some behavior support or their life situation has changed since they've surrendered, they can either help us find a placement for that dog, or we can, or they can take the dog themselves with some extra support. And sometimes they don't want to, and that's fine too. We just want to be clear with them about where the dog is headed, and engage them in possible solutions. And again, in some cases, we make exceptions. If there's been a severe incident and aggression, we don't contact the owner or finder. For a lot of dogs that are declining, we just want to get them out of the shelter, even for a day, just to get some further evaluation. It's so heartbreaking to me that so 75% of our dogs are unknown history. We know nothing about them. It's really sad to see these dogs that you're like, this dog is unhandleable in the shelter. You get it out for like half a day, and all of a sudden the dog is like a totally normal dog. We have special volunteers and fosters that take these dogs out. It's not just your first-time foster. These are folks who want to do this work. They take them out, they take them on a hike, they take them to get to the fast food place, whatever it is, just to get them out. And at least half the time, we see significantly different behaviors from the dogs just getting them out of the shelter. We do a medical evaluation. We know that broken teeth and sore hips and other kinds of pain will animals to act differently than they would otherwise. So every dog before it dies in our care gets a medical evaluation. And if we can't handle it, if it's really fractious and we can't handle it, we'll sedate it and then do the medical evaluation before euthanasia. Okay, so we issue a rescue plea and we give people time to respond. This is a toughie because we know these dogs with behavioral challenges are going back to our communities, and people like Trish and I spend an awful lot of time thinking about the ethics of this. There are a certain number of dogs that we don't plead a rescue. We just say we don't believe that these animals can safely be returned to the community. But in most cases, when dogs don't have a severe known history of harming a person or animal, if they're just declining in the shelter, we're going to give our rescue partners an opportunity to help. And then we help the rescue partners be successful in their placement. We don't usually, if a rescue really wants to help, we give them some option. And for some of our dogs, we're like, look, this dog is going to have to go to a sanctuary. It is going to have to not be released back into the community. Do you have an option for that? Well, they don't, because that doesn't really exist other than like Best Friends and a couple of other places. They don't have viable options for that. And so that dog may life man, but it gets people thinking. Maybe we need more sanctuary shelters. Maybe we need more places where dogs can get long-term rehabilitation. It gets the community thinking about solving the problem. We notify volunteers and staff. This one terrifies everyone. We have an opt-in. This is probably the most important part of this presentation. So anytime we are going to kill a dog for behavior, we have an opt-in group. It's called like At-Risk Dogs at PAC. You can join it. We're going to notify you anytime we're going to put down an animal for behavior. We're going to let you know 24 hours in advance minimum. Usually it's a week. We'll let you know. But here's the catch. You can't tell us, don't euthanize that dog. You can't tell us, I'm really mad at you. You guys are crazy. How can you kill that dog? You don't get to do any of those things. You actually have to commit to one thing, which is only trying to find solutions within what we offer. So some dogs, it's a notification only. We're like, this dog is going to be euthanized in 24 hours. Here's what happened. That would be like a dog that had severely bitten a person. In other cases, we'll say, we have a 1-week deadline. We need to find a rescue placement for this dog where it's going to receive behavioral rehabilitation. And we let the volunteers help us do that. And time again, they do help us do it, and we find viable outcome options for our dogs. And by the way, we track the outcomes of every one of our dogs. So when we do this, we're not just saying goodbye. We're following them for up to 2 years after they leave our shelter because we want to know that this works and that these dogs can be placed successfully long term. This is our discussion group. So we invite key people in to discuss the cases. If we have a dog that's been in the shelter for a while, we know that dog is at risk. That's the number of people we have doing case management and discussion. So those are all staff and volunteers. They meet once a week to talk about our hard cases. And this is the euthanasia form. So what it looks like when you have an animal like this is that you can see all the steps I just walked you through. Those are all checked, and we know those steps have been completed. Or if in a case where we're not going to complete one of the steps, we explain why. And then there's 4 signatures. I sign off personally on every one, as does the manager, as does the caseworker. These are all stopgaps to making sure that you're taking euthanasia seriously, and that you are making sure that you've afforded every dog in your care, and for some of you, every cat, an equal set of you've given them sort of an objective chance to get out of the shelter alive. I almost said Bill of Rights, but it's not exactly that, because not every animal gets afforded every one of these. But that's what the form looks like once it's completed. And we're turning it into an online form, actually. So So these are 2 dogs that ended up being saved through the protocol. So Bonnie is the black and white dog, and she was her and her brother were involved in an incident biting another dog. We did not want to, the brother was the initial dog that was identified as the dog that bit. When we called the owner to check, she was like, oh no, the brother didn't do anything, it was Bonnie that did it. We didn't want to put Bonnie into just a regular old home. We let the volunteers know that she was at risk, and the volunteers found her a placement. She was like 12. They found her, and she had she had cancer or something. She wasn't going to live long. They found her a long-term behavioral hospice home, and where she was able to live until old age. And then Cinnamon is another one, which I don't have time to tell you. Okay. So here's how you need to change your current organization. You need to know how many dogs were killed for behavior in previous calendar year, what the percentage was, the dog-by-dog reasons for euthanasia, and the shelter's policy on who makes the decisions. If you're a director, you have a responsibility to know all of these things. It's no longer okay for us to just say staff handles it. We need to know what animals are dying and why. I guarantee your staff isn't telling you everything, mostly because you create work for them. This was a survey done through Maddie's Fund. We surveyed about 250 folks about what's still putting dogs at risk in your shelter: fear-based aggression, kennel stress, barrier reactivity, resource guarding, dog selective, bite history, prey drive. All of these things are still putting dogs at risk in shelters. So most shelters, dogs are still dying for all these reasons. So we're not talking, in this presentation, what I'm talking about is not your highest level dogs. I understand there are dogs you don't feel safe releasing. This is about all the other ones that are still dying, and most of that can be stopped by following this protocol. And here are the steps to implement it. This is not easy stuff to talk about. I don't have all the answers. We have been piloting this since 2013. We've been following all the dogs. We know since 2013, of all the euthanasia listed dogs, all the dogs slated for euthanasia for behavior, we know that we've successfully saved about half. And of those, the rate of return is no higher, and the rate of future incidents is no higher. And by putting the form online, we're hoping to pilot some of this with other shelters because we want to be following these dogs over years to see how they're doing. The goal is that we decrease incidents, safety incidents, we increase positive placements, and we reduce unnecessary euthanasia of dogs for behavioral reasons in shelters. Thanks.